The Gilded Age is produced by Universal Television and brought to you by HBO of Warner Media. All characters, plot points, and footage are property of HBO. The Gilded Age is a brand new drama airing exclusively on HBO Max. Join your friends at Free Tours by Foot as we take you through New York City, showing you actual locations from the show, locations in New York City the show is based around, discuss plot points, and go over the actual history of all of the events of the Gilded Age. And remember to book your tour with freetoursbyfoot.com the next time you visit New York City or any one of our other locations. And now, on to Katherine.
So as we get to the penultimate episode of season 1, one of the things you might be wondering about is, what is this quadrille?
Gentlemen, do not swing the women around like sacks of hay.
They are starting to talk about so much, and you're seeing the rehearsal for Gladys's coming out ball.
How long will you be in Newport? 10 days.
So quadrilles, very simply, are a dance that are performed by 4 couples.
Remember, everyone, the quadrille is not a romping dance.
If that sounds familiar to you, this is actually considered the precursor to the American square dance. Quadrilles had actually been around for a long time as a form of social dancing before the period of the Gilded Age, but they took on sort of a life of their own during this time period. The quadrille, this dance of 4 couples, which was set to 5 different sections of music, became almost a pageant that would be performed at some of these Gilded Age balls. And so that's what they're talking about for Gladys's coming out ball, is not just a dance. There's going to be plenty of dancing at that ball, but what they're talking about is this pageant element, which is going to be rehearsed. It's going to have costumes. Many quadrilles had a theme. A lot of Gilded Age balls actually featured several quadrilles all in the same night, all with different costumes, all with different themes. So it's really just another way of showing kind of the lavishness, the money that your family had. So what they're doing in the Gilded Age, though, I think is giving us a sneak peek into how Mrs. Russell is ultimately going to win the war. Now, she has lost several battles of breaking into high society. We just saw her at the end of this episode being kicked out the back door of Mrs. Astor's home, and she's there with the chickens and the beating the rugs. But I think what we're about to see is her, like I said, winning the war. If we base this on history, so the story of a quadrille featuring Carrie Astor is something that really happened. It happened with Alva Vanderbilt, who we've said many, many times we think Mrs. Russell is based on. When Mrs. Vanderbilt finished her grand home, her petite chateau on 5th Avenue, as a housewarming party, she had this giant masquerade ball. We've actually mentioned it in a previous episode. The guest list had over 1,000 people, and like many balls of the time, it was going to feature quadrilles. And Carrie Astor had been rehearsing a quadrille with her friends for many, many weeks. They had costumes, they'd been rehearsing, but she hadn't actually been invited to the ball yet. And it turned out this was the ultimate power move on the part of Alva Vanderbilt. She was going to use Carrie's participation, her desire to be in this quadrille with her friends, as a way of finally getting Mrs. Caroline Astor to call on her and her to officially be accepted into New York high society. Carrie hadn't received an invitation, wanted to go to the ball so she could do her quadrille with her friends, and in order for that to happen, Mrs. Caroline Astor first had to formally call on Alva Vanderbilt. She had to go to the house, she had to leave her calling card, and Mrs. Astor was finally kind of showing acceptance for Alva Vanderbilt, and that was the only way Carrie Russell's invitation was actually going to find its way to her. She got her invitation to the ball the next day, and Alva Vanderbilt had arrived. So I think we're about to see the same thing. You can see how calculated she's been with getting these different people to participate so that their parents will really almost be forced to show up at Gladys's ball. This has been her whole reason throughout for keeping Gladys's coming out delayed, was so she could get the right people at the ball. and this is how she's going to do it. So we'll probably see that play out in the next episode. So something that you have been seeing all throughout season 1 so far is sort of the dichotomy between the lives of the people that own the home and the servants who work in it. In fact, you've maybe noticed that they don't even use the same entrance of the house.
What's he doing in the basement if he's coming to call?
And this is something that's very historically accurate in the Gilded Age. The main entrance of the home in that time period, this home was built in the 1880s, so about the same time period, the main entrance of the home was actually raised up a level from the street. And so that was called the parlor level of the home. That's where the family's parlor and dining room, those formal spaces would have been. So the servants of the house, other than to open the door for guests, would have never used that door to come and go themselves. They actually, and you see this with the Van Ryns in particular, in most homes actually had a doorway that was tucked underneath the stairs. That was where the servants could come and go, and it was really just not considered proper for them to ever use that main doorway for themselves. And that's really because the servants, even though they did live in the house, really stayed very, very separated from the family that they would have worked for. The servants typically lived on their own floor of the house. Often it was the very top floor of the house. The top floor of the house tended to have a little more soot in it from all the fireplaces. It usually wasn't quite as comfortable temperature-wise, either too hot or too cold. So that is where the servants' quarters would have been. Now you're really seeing, and we've talked about this a couple times, two very, very different setups when it comes to servants is between the Van Ryns, one of these old money Knickerbocker families, and the Russells, primarily in the size of the staff. So the Van Ryns have a much smaller household staff, and we've talked about how they kind of do things in a more old-fashioned way. They have this English butler. But the other thing that you're seeing is actually that their servants tend to double up on a lot of jobs. Mrs. Armstrong is the housekeeper, but she also does the job of a lady's maid, whereas in a house like the Russells, they have a different servant for all of these jobs. They have a much, much larger staff, and it wouldn't have been unusual in that time period to see a house like the Russells, a family like the Russells, have a household staff of 20 or more people where everybody has a very separate, distinct job. But I know Lori and I talked about in a previous episode, you're also seeing that the attachment that the Russells seem to have to their much, much larger staff is very different than what you're seeing with the Van Ryns. You have this ongoing feud between Mrs. Van Ryn and Bannister, but she hasn't fired him, even though she's furious with him and sometimes won't even talk to him.
I've told John he can leave early, so I'll be dealing with the coffee.
You might ask John for some tips on how he served it when he took over from you that time. He managed things so efficiently.
Yes, Mum.
And after this conflict between Peggy and Armstrong, where Armstrong was very clearly in the wrong and Mrs. Van Ryn has said she is in the wrong, she still doesn't fire her. So there is this differing sense of loyalty to their staff.
Wouldn't it have been better to lose Armstrong?
And have me train a new maid in all my ways at my time of life.
And wanting to keep continuity in their staff that you don't see across the street at the Russells. Mrs. Russell had a problem with Turner, she fired Turner. She had no problem making church stand aside so that Bannister could come over and she could have a successful luncheon. They don't really seem to have the same relationships between these two different sides. Now that said, I'm not saying the Van Ryns consider their servants a part of their family, because they absolutely do not.
Servants must have a life, Aunt Agnes.
Why?
They very much consider them servants. They are not a part of the family, but they are a part of the household in a way that they seem to take very, very seriously. And speaking of Peggy, we've finally seen this unveiling of what this secret is that she has been holding. And you may or may not have been confused by it. You know, what would the big difference be between her being an unwed mother or her being this woman who was married and had a child that passed away? What difference would it really make to Mrs. Van Ryn? And the answer is it would make an enormous difference to Mrs. Van Ryn. Even though the people working in these households are servants, it was considered important to a family of high social standing that their servants be of unimpeachable moral character, that they abide by these very strict rules and moral codes. And so, no, it really would have made a difference to Mrs. Van Ryn what the answer was to what was Peggy's secret. And of course, you see that Peggy is the one to leave rather than Armstrong. But we have seen these two women's very, very different backgrounds. The neighborhood Armstrong comes from, which is clearly a tenement neighborhood, and the very wealthy family that Peggy comes from. So even though Peggy has been the one to leave, even though she was not in the wrong, I have a feeling she's going to land on her feet. She has this very nice home to go back to and this budding career as a journalist. So I think we are going to see some leaps forward for Peggy in this final episode. So we only have one episode left of the Gilded Age Season 1, and we're starting to see a lot of these storylines coming together really, really quickly. In this episode, we did finally figure out what Peggy's secret was that she had been holding on to, that she was married previously and had given birth to this child, and that's why she needed Mr. Rakes' help, was to try to find this midwife to learn more about what had happened. But I think we're going to continue to see what happens with her story. She has gone home to Brooklyn, but she's still working with the paper, and there might be some really exciting stuff coming up with that. We have seen the outcome of Mr. Russell's legal troubles regarding the train crash. And this is an area where they did really veer very differently from history. I know we talked about the Spite and Dival train crash and what they've done in the Gilded Age, while slightly based off of that. It's very, very different. And ultimately, he is free and clear. He is legally cleared of responsibility. They figured out what had happened. So it seems like what we have coming up to finish out the season is we are finally going to see Gladys's coming out. We're going to see this quadrille. Does Mrs. Astor make an appearance or not? Does Mrs. Russell finally win what she's been working towards this entire season? We'll see. And obviously, we see Marion getting ready to make some major moves with Mr. Rakes, and considering this elopement, you know how all of us here at Set in New York feel about Mr. Rakes. We'll see what happens, but we'll see you very soon to talk about that finale episode.